what America was and what it can become. This is Liberty Town Hall.
Appreciate you spending time today with Liberty Town Hall. And check out our website as well, libertytownhall.com. Going to be having a conversation today with Kimberly Roberson. She is on Skype right now from California, the northern side. Appreciate you being with us today. Hi, Kimberly.
Hi, thank you. Nice to be here.
Pleasure to talk to you today. I appreciate you doing so. You have wrote a book. It's called, for those of you watching today, Silence is Deafening, Fukushima Fallout, A Mother's Response. I always say this when it comes to a powerful or unusual subject, and this certainly is both. I mean, when we were 5 years old, all of us boys wanted to be cowboys, Batman and Robin or something, and girls wanted to be princesses or ballerinas. Nobody wakes up and says, well, I ought to write a book on this. Tell me the story.
That's for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Tell me the story.
Absolutely.
What brought you to do this?
Well, I'm an older mother, and I have a young child, and as every parent knows, we definitely care so much about our children. We'll do anything to protect them. And I have kind of a unique history in that I basically worked many years ago on nuclear waste issues with an organization called Greenpeace. And I was in Washington, D.C. one day opening up a letter that was from the Chernobyl region of the Soviet Union, at that time Soviet Union, and there were pictures of deformed farm animals. And I was working on the East-West campaign. Greenpeace was about to open up their first office in Moscow, and so this was absolutely shocking. We turned the pictures over to the photo department, which then the photos ended up in Time and Newsweek magazine. So then flash forward, another 5 years, I worked here in California to help block a proposed low-level radioactive waste dump in California, which would have been, we were told, for booties and gloves from nuclear medicine, but in fact, it was determined to be for decommissioned nuclear reactor parts. And unlined trenches directly above the Colorado River, with a waterway to our agricultural water here in California. So I learned a lot about so-called low-level radiation then, and then I decided to become a nutritionist. So as life happens sometimes on a trajectory, I focused a lot on food for the next 10 years in my practice and where I was working. So on March 11th of last year, when this terrible triple nuclear meltdown scenario began at Fukushima, the world was paying attention to the tsunami and the earthquake. But the triple whammy, of course, was the nuclear meltdown, which we are still dealing with now. And one of the reasons I wanted to come on and talk to you today is because we know from watching this issue every day virtually for 18, going on 19 months now, we have substantiated data, measurable amounts of radiation in California topsoil. And this is directly because of Fukushima. And also, we could talk much more about this, but there's an ongoing incineration, absolute calamity in the works right now. The Japanese government has moved tens of millions of tons of tsunami and earthquake rubble around the nation of Japan. They were already an incineration nation, which I didn't realize, but it makes sense. They're an island country. So they already have the municipal incinerators there. Well, now they're burning the wreckage, and much of it is industrial, contaminated with industrial waste. Some of it with radioactive waste. And this is just in time for our rainy season. It's starting now, but they've been incinerating. They began a few months ago. So now they have plans to just incinerate the lot of it. And here in California, we grow over 450 varieties of agricultural crops. We're the nation's #1 producer of dairy. We're the #1 producer of wine, obviously Napa and Sonoma Valley. And so if somebody, for instance, living in Michigan thinks that they're not feeling the effects, if any of your produce, dairy, wine is coming from California, and we want to be careful. I work with a group called Fukushima Fallout Awareness Network. I started the group after I wrote a petition calling for food monitoring, and that was in April of last year. It led to the book, and it led to Fukushima Fallout Awareness Network. And so we've been watching this very closely. And unless we really pressure our government to pay attention to this, it's going to continue being completely, deafening silence, as the book says. So the book is a way to, for me as a stay-at-home mom, a way that I was able to just get it out, bear witness to what had happened in my life when I knew about what happened at Chernobyl. I know about what happens with the food, and I know the impact on children. And I'm hoping people will read the book and find that they do have power. They are more empowered today probably than ever before because of the internet. And there are things we can do. Our group has met with Senators Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein's offices a total of 10 times, 5 each. And at one point, we talked directly to Senator Feinstein and told her that we have information from University of California, Berkeley, School of Nuclear Engineers. You can look them up online. That's UCB SNE. Just Google it and food monitoring, and you'll see that they've been sampling since late March of last year. Although they have stopped in some ways, but the data is there. I think they just recently won an award, actually, for their work monitoring. I saw that the other day, and posting this information and being transparent online. But you will find at the bottom of the website, it's with the caveat that this is comparable to taking a cross-country airline flight, which is completely untrue and very misleading. We don't ingest radiation when we're on a plane flying, across country. And as I said before, children are particularly at risk. Their bodies are growing rapidly. Their cells are dividing rapidly. And as we're seeing now in Japan, there's been, I believe, a 39% increase in thyroid nodules that are being recorded now. And this is what we saw at Chernobyl. It's not like this is the first time this has happened. So if we have an opportunity to switch over to forms of energy that are much safer and which are available, I think now is the time to do it, and not to fall into a false sense of security that Japan, well, it's over there. Japan is, from California, about the same plane distance as to the East Coast. Hawaii, right in the middle of the ocean, their dairy farmers are very concerned and have been taking measures to spread boron on their land where their cattle graze.
Let's talk about that when we come back, because we're running up to a break right now, and why they're doing that, and then the other things we've discussed. This is a powerful interview. Please stay with us. We'll be back with more. This is Liberty Town Hall. We're back with Kimberly Roberson. She is the author of the book, Silent Deafening, Fukushima Fallout, A Mother's Response. It's kind of funny, none of us even could ever pronounce when that first came out, Fukushima. We're just not built for that, for the Japanese language for a while. It took us all a little while to do so. But It is a powerful subject that we're talking about today. If you've just tuned in, we're discussing literally the fallout from what's going on in Fukushima, what originally happened and what's going on today. And I wanted to just take a quick sidebar as a quick personal story. My son is 25 years old, my youngest one, and he was born with severe deformities of his legs and his arms. And nobody could figure out why that happened. The doctors just did not know, and he was treated and treated and treated. And then all of a sudden, I was still living in St. Louis at the time, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch had a big story in one of the sections about Chernobyl babies coming to St. Louis for treatment. And they had a big full body picture of a young girl that was about my son's age, kind of about my son's age, I think, at the time. And there she was with the very same arm and leg deformities. Stunned me to no end. Since we found out there has been radiation where we're from in eastern Kentucky originally, and we can't prove it. It's just one of those things you can't tell, but we believe that my son's mother was exposed to some of that stuff. And hence this kind of thing happens. But that's what really grabbed my attention with this story. It's just like stunning to make the connection with Chernobyl and then Fukushima, which may even be worse.
Absolutely. We totally do believe that it's worse. At Chernobyl, you had 1 reactor. Fukushima, you have 3. And they didn't do what they did at Chernobyl here in this scenario. Since Fukushima's on the beach, they weren't able to dig underneath and dig a protective layer. There were an estimated 60,000 workers. There could even be more, who sacrificed their lives basically to create a sarcophagus over Chernobyl and to dig underneath. And it's actually decaying very badly right now. It's not just a done deal. And in Japan, what we've seen with Tokyo Electric and Power Company and the Japanese government is they really do believe that they can fix this. And what we're seeing is a slow realization as the United Nations becomes involved and pressure from the international community that they will have to expand the evacuation zone. Rather than do this, they are forcing families to move back to Fukushima,
What?
including young children. Absolutely. There's a major effort right now to relocate them back. This has brought their country incredible shame, and they believe that they can remediate this lethal radioactive waste. Some of it will be hazardous for tens of millions of years. In our media, we heard at that time about iodine 131 that has a half-life of 8 days. Iodine 129 has a half-life of 16 million years. And in between, you have hundreds of other radioisotopes that are lethal and highly dangerous. And, you know, I really believed with writing this book that it was so much I came around, to believing while I was writing it. I didn't set out to do it. It was something that just seemed like it was the right thing to do. But now that we have wind technology, solar, for the first time last year, there was a study that showed that we are outpacing new installations of alternative energy sources. They're outpacing nuclear and coal, the so-called, more traditional dirty industries. They create waste. So what are we going to do? The book asks, are we going to wait for another terrible situation like this to happen? We have 104 reactors in the United States. Here in California, I think I'll say this because whoever's watching around the country, California affects you because we grow 80% and more of a lot of the produce that you eat. And we have 2 nuclear reactors here in our state. They're both in Southern California, and Diablo Canyon and San Onofre. And they are both built on active earthquake faults in tsunami zones directly on the shore and within miles of the California Central Valley, a very short distance to the Central Valley, which is growing our nation's food supply. So Diablo Canyon was shut down for 3 months due to a jellyfish blocking an outfall pipe. It went into emergency shutdown earlier this year. San Onofre remains in shutdown. Concerned citizens are trying their hardest to keep it closed because we don't understand. No one seems to know why the fuel assembly rods started shaking violently, which led to the shutdown. These were new rods that were installed. There's no reason why this should have been happening. But of course, there's an industry push to keep these reactors open because, as we often know, what happens in California tends to reverberate across the country, and it would be terrible thing for the nuclear industry to start closing reactors. It's as though they are pushing harder than ever to open new ones, given what's happened at Fukushima.
Incredible.
So, yeah, I know. It's like I couldn't make this stuff up if I tried. It flies in the face of reason. Talk about a national security issue. This is our food supply. This is our air, our water. And we have 104 of these all around the United States. And you had mentioned Kentucky. We have potentially lethal scenarios all over the United States. Chernobyl was terrible, and the government there took steps to protect citizens that they aren't taking in Japan, and so we really need to put pressure on them. There's my website, silencedeafening.com. If you go on there, you'll find the petition, also a petition to stop the incineration. This is what puts it in a different category. This was not something that happened last year. As long as they're continuing to incinerate some of the radioactive waste in the form of tsunami wreckage and all of this toxic waste. I mean, it was the worst industrial accident as well in world history, not only the worst nuclear accident. As long as they continue to incinerate it, we're going to continue to feel the effects because it comes down with the rain. And here we are coming into our rainy season right now. So
Powerful stuff. And this subject's not going away by any stretch. Thanks for being here on Liberty Town Hall.
thank you for having me. Thanks.
Finishing up today's Liberty Town Hall, Kimberly Roberson is my guest. She is the author of Silence, Deafening, Fukushima Fallout, A Mother's Response. I appreciate so much her taking the time to be with us today. It's very kind of you, Kimberly. It's great to have you today.
Thank you. It's really great to be here.
Let me hit on something that you talked about earlier, and that's boron being dropped on the land in Hawaii. But we didn't get a chance to explain that in detail. Why are people dropping boron in Hawaii? What does that do?
Well, it helps to somewhat mitigate the radiation, and they found that out at Chernobyl when it was dumped. Just tons of it were dumped on top of the reactor there after it melted down. And they found that it did help to lower radiation levels. And this was one of the first things that I found in my research online last year, probably in May or June. I wrote the petition calling for food monitoring on April 1st of last year, 2 weeks after this all started. And then I found a few months later that the dairy farmers on the Big Island in Hawaii were trying to, lessen the radiation levels by using boron so that their dairy cattle would not be radioactive, basically. And this is something that they're continuing to do. And this measure is probably going to be used more and more in the United States. They've been doing it in Japan, but there's only so much that you can do. The only real solution is to shut down these reactors. It's a lethal form of energy over which we really have no control. We're fooling ourselves. The waste that it generates, for instance, remains toxic, hazardous, I should say, for tens of millions of years. And actually, I just want to mention that quite recently, the NRC ordered a halt to all new licenses until they can find a way to somehow safely guard the tens of millions of tons of radioactive waste that have been accumulating since nuclear power began back in the 60s and 70s. So, more boron is one thing people are doing. There are other things, just in our personal lives I can talk to you a little bit about that people can do. There's a blog on my website as well. But
give that website real quick before you give the details on the list.
Sure. It's www.silencedeafening.com, DEAFENING.com.
Now go over that list a little bit then, because I really want to give a chance for people to hear what can they do to help themselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But, I need to be clear, and one thing that I definitely have learned that cannot be denied, that there has to be a way to, as soon as possible, transition to safe renewable energy in the United States. And by the way, with the elections just happening, I found out that an equal number of Republicans and Democrats want solar power. This is not really a bipartisan issue that divides the country. If you ask Republicans, they want it. You ask Democrats, they want it. It's even Wall Street will not continue to finance the nuclear power industry because of so many variables, so many questions with how to safely manage the waste, the operations. It's becoming incredibly expensive.
Oh yeah, liability issue, yeah.
It's absolutely a liability issue. And could I talk for just a minute about how we even got here with nuclear power, just very quickly? This is actually something that evolved, I should say, after World War II, after using, the atomic bomb. President Eisenhower gave a speech saying that we wanted to have this form of energy. We wanted to turn it into something good for humankind. And they promised that it would be too cheap to meter. And it was called the Atoms for Peace program. And at one point, President Eisenhower said, we have to be careful to defend from without what we cannot protect from within. And I always took those words to mean that this is something that could definitely have a backlash. And in fact, that is what we're seeing now. It's incredibly expensive, it's incredibly dangerous, it's incredibly wasteful, and we do have the alternatives. But we can't just completely turn our back on the damage that it's done in our country either. It's not just enough to turn to solar and wind and certain geothermal, biomass, all of these other available sources. We have to go back now and try to identify where in the United States we've had the hottest spots from the radioactive fallout. And we have to do our best to try to mitigate that, because this is transgenerational DNA damage. It doesn't just go from one generation. We have found, the late Dr. Rosalie Bertell in her book, Prognosis for a Radioactive Earth, identified this as transgenerational DNA damage. And now you'll find plenty of experts that say that, including Arnie Gunderson with Fairwinds, which is another great website that your viewers should go to. And it's linked on my website. If you go to the contact section, you'll find about a dozen groups that are working very hard on this issue, all with their own websites. Not so much specifically on the food issue, but on the nuclear safety issue in general and how we can transition safely.
Well, there's so much more we can talk about. I mean, including I wish we had time to get into renewables and so forth as well, because I mean that issue is huge in and of itself. We've got zoning issues where people say, "Oh, they're unsightly. We can't have that stuff." I mean, there's places that are zoning out solar panels on roofs instead of shingles because they think they're unsightly. And then we've got a technology, and you've probably heard that some. And then we've got a technology issue. Think about this for a second as we wrap up the show today. Wind power has got an issue that just, and I don't understand it, how you can have a dynamo that can spin so fast that it can make airplanes go up and down, and yet wind generators have to go and hit their brakes when they reach above 35 miles an hour. When you've got storms, you think it'd be a perfect time to have a bunch of wind generators going with 50-mile-an-hour winds. We've got to get in and make this stuff perfect, because sometimes it's not ready for prime time. But we got to hit on this more because there's so much to talk about. We've barely scratched the surface. Will you come back again?
I absolutely will. Thank you so much for having me.
Glad to do it. My name is Greg Marshall. Glenn Wilson here as well. Appreciate you watching today's Liberty Town Hall.
But a constitutional government, once changed from freedom, can never be restored. Liberty, once lost, is lost forever.